The year was 1878, and the silence of Ada Weston's life was as vast and unyielding as the plains that stretched from her doorstep to the bruised horizon. Her cabin, a small, stubborn knot of timber against the endless Wyoming sky, was less a home than a fortress against memory. Here, silence was a currency she had earned at a terrible price, and she spent it hoarding the quiet of her days, measuring them out in the rhythmic chop of an axe, the scrape of a hoe in her meager garden, and the sigh of the wind through the lone cottonwood that shaded her roof. Her world had shrunk to this small patch of earth, a world bounded by the creek to the south and the dark, whispering line of the forest to the north. Beyond that lay the town of Providence, a place she had not set foot in for 3 years. The people there knew her only by a cruel moniker whispered behind cupped hands, the Scarred Woman. The name was a plain truth, but in their mouths it became an epithet, a judgment that branded her as something other, something broken. The scars themselves were a chaotic map of a single night. They pulled at the left side of her face, twisting her eye into a permanent look of surprise and drawing her mouth into a semblance of a frown, even when her heart was still. They were the color of old parchment, a stark, pale geography against the healthy skin of her right cheek. They were the last gift from the fire that had taken everything else: her husband, Thomas, and their infant daughter, Rose. The flames had kissed her face and left a permanent reminder of the heat that had consumed her world, leaving her in a cold, solitary aftermath. Her routine was the anchor that kept her from drifting into the abyss of what was. She rose with the first hint of grey light, her movements economical and practiced. She checked her snares, milked her single goat, and tended the vegetables that fought a constant battle with the dry, unforgiving soil. She worked until her muscles ached, a welcome pain that drowned out the phantom ache in her arms, the hollow where a child should have been. Her life was a litany of chores, a penance of practicality. She was a woman whittled down to the bare wood of survival, the ornate carvings of joy, love, and hope long since burned away. Loneliness was a physical presence, a cold spot in the bed beside her, an empty chair at her small table. It had a weight, and she carried it with the same stoic resignation with which she carried buckets of water from the creek. One afternoon in late summer, the sky turned the color of a bad bruise. The air grew heavy and thick, charged with an energy that made the hair on her arms stand on end. The wind, which usually spoke in murmurs, began to shriek, tearing at the cottonwood's leaves and throwing dust against her cabin's single glass window. Ada secured the goat in its lean-to, latched the shutters, and laid another log on the fire. Storms on the plains were violent, biblical things, and she respected their power. As dusk fell and the storm unleashed its full fury, the world outside dissolved into a roaring chaos of wind and water. Rain lashed the cabin in sheets, and thunder cracked like the sky itself was splitting apart. Inside, the firelight threw dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. Ada sat by the hearth, her hands clasped in her lap, listening. It was in moments like these, when the world was loud, that the silence inside her became most deafening. She was thinking of Rose, of the impossible softness of her cheek, when another sound cut through the storm's symphony. It was faint, almost lost in a gust of wind, but it was undeniably there. A high, thin wail, not an animal, not a cougar's scream or a coyote's cry. It was the sound of a child. Ada froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was a trick of the wind, she told herself, a phantom born of grief, a cruel echo of the cries that haunted her dreams. But then it came again, clearer this time, a desperate, terrified sob carried on the tempest. It came from the direction of the forest. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to bar the door and feed the fire. The world outside her small clearing had brought her nothing but pain. The forest was Cheyenne territory, a fact the people of Providence never failed to mention with a shudder, spinning tales of savagery that Ada had always suspected were just fear talking. To interfere, to involve herself in anything beyond her own grim survival, was to invite disaster. Trouble from the townsfolk, who saw her as an outcast, or trouble from the Cheyenne, who would see her as a threat. Yet, the sound pierced through her carefully constructed walls of self-preservation. It was the sound of a small thing, lost and alone in the teeth of the storm. It was the sound that resonated with the deepest, most wounded part of her soul. For a long moment, she battled herself, the cold logic of survival warring with an instinct she thought had died in the fire. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from the very foundation of her being, Ada rose. She pulled on her worn oilskin coat, lit a lantern, and unbolted the door. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it back against the cabin wall as she stepped out into the maelstrom. The lantern light was a feeble, flickering thing, barely cutting through the driving rain. Ada shielded it with her body, her head bowed against the wind as she moved toward the tree line. The ground was already slick with mud, sucking at her boots. She called out, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. She followed the sound, a beacon in the chaos, a thin thread of human misery pulling her forward. She found him huddled at the base of a massive pine, his small body shaking uncontrollably. He was a toddler, no more than 2 years old, his dark hair plastered to his face and his simple leather tunic soaked through. He was a Cheyenne child. His face was a mask of terror, streaked with rain and tears, his dark eyes wide and lost. When the lantern light fell upon him, he flinched, pressing himself harder against the rough bark of the tree. Ada's breath caught in her throat. He was so small, so utterly alone. All her fears about providence and politics and prejudice evaporated, replaced by a singular, overwhelming impulse. She knelt in the mud, keeping the lantern low, so as not to frighten him further. She said nothing, knowing her voice might only add to his terror. Slowly, she held out a hand, palm up. It was a gesture she used to soothe her goat, a universal sign of peace. He stared at her hand, then his gaze traveled up to her face. The lantern light was unforgiving. It illuminated the ridges and valleys of her scars, casting them in stark relief. The child's eyes widened further, and a fresh wave of sobs shook his tiny frame. He recoiled from her, a small, wounded animal shrinking from a perceived predator. The rejection was a familiar sting, a pain she had learned to endure from adults, but seeing it in the face of a child was a fresh, sharp agony. Ignoring the hurt, Ada gently scooped him into her arms. He stiffened, fighting her for a moment with a surprising strength, his small fists beating against her chest. She held him firm but gentle, turning her body to shield him from the worst of the wind and rain. She murmured soft, meaningless sounds, the universal language of comfort, as she carried him back through the roaring darkness toward the flickering warmth of her cabin. Inside, the sudden warmth and light seemed to stun him into silence. Ada barred the door, shutting out the storm, and for a moment they simply stood there in the center of the small room, dripping onto the floorboards. The child in her arms was shivering violently, his skin like ice. His fear was a palpable thing, a wild energy contained in his small body. Ada moved with a purpose that overrode her own exhaustion and trepidation. She set him down on the rag rug before the fire and quickly stripped off his wet tunic. She wrapped him in the driest, softest blanket she owned, one she had woven herself in the long, silent evenings. He watched her every move, his dark eyes never leaving her face, his gaze tracing the scarred landscape of her cheek. He didn't cry, but his silence was heavier, more unnerving than his sobs had been. She offered him a small bowl of goat's milk, warmed by the fire. He turned his head away, his lips pressed into a thin, stubborn line. She tried a piece of bread, softened in the milk. He refused that too. He was a captive, and she, with her disfigured face, was his captor. Trust was a bridge too far to build in a single night. The hours crept by. The storm raged on, a constant, violent drumming against the roof and walls. The child sat huddled in the blanket, a small, unmoving statue of misery. Every so often, a shudder would rack his body, and a low, mournful whimper would escape his lips. He was calling for his mother, Ada knew, in a language she could not understand, but a sentiment that was etched upon her very soul. Ada sat in her rocking chair a few feet away, watching him. She felt a profound and painful helplessness. She could offer him warmth and shelter, but she could not offer him the comfort he truly needed. She could not give him back his mother, his family, his world. In his profound loss, she saw a terrifyingly clear reflection of her own. They were two castaways, marooned on the island of her hearth, surrounded by a storm of grief. As the night deepened, the child's whimpers grew into a steady, heartbreaking cry. It was not a loud, demanding wail, but a quiet, hopeless sound of pure despair. It frayed Ada's nerves, scraping at the raw edges of her own sorrow until she felt she might shatter. She tried speaking to him in a low, soft voice, but her words were meaningless sounds to him. She tried moving closer, but he only shrank away, his eyes fixed on her scars. Finally, in an act of pure desperation, she did the one thing she had not done since the fire. She began to sing. It wasn't a conscious decision. The music simply rose from a deep, forgotten well inside her. It was a lullaby her own mother had sung to her, the same one she had sung to Rose in the brief, beautiful time she'd had with her. Her voice was rusty from disuse, thin and hesitant at first, but it held the melody. "Hush now, little one, the moon is pale. The wind in the willows tells a tale of sleepy stars in a silver sky. Close your eyes now, by and by." The words were simple, the tune a gentle, rocking cadence, but as she sang, she poured all of her unspoken grief into the notes. She sang of loss and loneliness, of a love that still burned like a phantom limb. She sang for Rose, for Thomas, for the woman she had been. Her voice grew stronger, clearer, filling the small cabin with a sound more profound than the storm's fury. The child stopped crying, his head tilted, and he watched her, his expression shifting from terror to a kind of solemn curiosity. The song was a language he did not know, but the melody was universal. It spoke of solace, of a gentle hand in the dark. Ada kept singing, her eyes half closed, lost in the memory the music invoked. She sang of fields of clover and the buzzing of bees, of a safe harbor and a steady light. The song was a prayer, an apology, a lament. It was the only truth she had left to offer. Slowly, cautiously, the little boy began to move. He crawled out from his blanket cocoon, inching across the rag rug toward her rocking chair. Ada's voice faltered for a moment, but she forced herself to continue, keeping her rhythm steady, her tone soft. He stopped just before her feet, looking up at her. His gaze was no longer on her scars, but on her mouth, where the sound was coming from. She finished the verse and started another, her voice now barely a whisper. The child reached out a small, hesitant hand and laid it on her knee. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that traveled straight to Ada's frozen heart. He then curled up on the floor, his head resting against her boot, his small body finally relaxing its tight coil of fear. Ada sang for what felt like hours. She sang until her throat was raw and her eyes burned with unshed tears. She didn't dare stop, didn't dare move, terrified that any change would break the fragile spell. The child's breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. All through the long, dark night, as the storm slowly spent its fury and retreated into a sullen drizzle, the woman with the scarred face sang a lullaby to the lost boy, their two solitudes momentarily bridged by the fragile power of a forgotten song. The first light of dawn was a pale, watery grey, filtering through the grime on the windowpane. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and utterly still. Ada had not slept. She had remained in her chair, the child asleep at her feet, his small hand still loosely gripping the leather of her boot. A profound quiet had settled over the cabin, a quiet different from the empty silence she was used to. This silence was full. It held the echo of the lullaby and the soft sound of a child's breathing. A sense of dread began to creep back in, cold and sharp in the morning air. The night had been a strange, timeless truce, but the day brought with it choices and consequences. The child had to be returned. But how? To simply leave him at the edge of the forest felt cruel, and to venture into Cheyenne lands was a risk she couldn't measure. And then there was Providence. News traveled fast in the territories. A lone woman with a native child, the assumptions they would make, the accusations they would level, sent a chill down her spine. As if summoned by her thoughts, she heard a sound that was not of the forest. The rhythmic thud of horses' hooves, steady and purposeful, approaching her cabin from the direction of the town. Her heart seized. She looked down at the sleeping boy, then at the door. There was nowhere to hide him, no time to think. She stood slowly, gently detaching his hand from her boot, and moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. 3 riders. She recognized the broad, imposing figure of Garrett Hale, the town sheriff. He was a man who governed through intimidation, his face set in a perpetual scowl of righteous authority. With him were 2 other men from the town, farmers whose land bordered the forest, their faces pinched with suspicion. They were not making a friendly call. She met them at the door, stepping outside and pulling it partially closed behind her, a futile attempt to shield the cabin's interior from their view. She stood on her small porch, her hands clasped before her, a posture of defense. "Morning, Sheriff," she said, her voice still rough from the night's singing. Garrett Hale didn't bother with pleasantries. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her steps. "Weston, saw your light on all night, in the storm." His eyes narrowed, sweeping over her with open disdain. "Heard some commotion." "Just the storm, Sheriff," Ada replied, keeping her gaze steady. "Is that so?" One of the other men, a farmer named Amos, sneered. "Funny. We was tracking a blood trail yesterday. Found a doe, killed and dragged off. Cheyenne work. Figured they might be close." His eyes flickered toward the forest, then back to her, glittering with a hateful excitement. "You ain't seen anything unusual, have you? Being so friendly with the woods and all." The implication was clear, sharp as a knife. She was an outsider, a creature of the wilderness, just as strange and suspect in their eyes as the people who lived in it. Before she could form a reply, a small sound came from inside the cabin, a sleepy murmur, the sound of a waking child. The 3 men's heads snapped toward the door. Garrett Hale's hand went to the pistol at his hip. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a low growl. There was no point in lying. The truth, in all its terrible complexity, was upon her. With a heavy heart, Ada pushed the door fully open. The boy was standing in the middle of the room, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, the large blanket pooled around his ankles. He looked small and impossibly vulnerable in the harsh morning light. A collective gasp came from the men. Amos's face contorted with rage. "I knew it, a heathen brat. She's harboring them." "Shut up, Amos," Hale snapped, but his own eyes were hard as flint as he stared at Ada. "What is the meaning of this, Weston? Did you steal this child?" "I found him," Ada said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. She stepped back, positioning herself between the men and the boy. The child, sensing the new and palpable threat, let out a frightened cry and ran to hide behind her skirts, his small hands clutching the rough fabric of her dress. The simple, trusting gesture sent a fierce, protective fire through Ada's veins. It was a feeling she thought she'd never have again. "He was lost. In the storm," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He would have died. He's one of them that killed the Millers last spring." The 3rd man spat. "They're vermin, all of them. The child's a wolf pup. Grow up to be a wolf." "He is a child," Ada said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. The woman who had hidden from whispers and stares for 3 years was now facing down 3 armed men. "And he is under my roof. You will not touch him." Sheriff Hale dismounted, his boots thudding on the hard-packed earth. He walked toward the porch, his face a mask of cold fury. He saw her not as a woman showing compassion, but as a traitor to her kind, her scarred face a fitting emblem for her twisted loyalties. "This is my town, my law," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And that thing is a problem. You've brought trouble to your own door, woman. Now give him to me. We'll take him back to Providence. Figure out what to do with him." Ada knew what they would figure out. He'd be locked in a cell, an object of fear and hatred, or worse. She looked down at the small head pressed against her leg, felt the trembling of his body, and her resolve hardened into something unbreakable. "No," she said. Hale's eyes widened in disbelief. "What did you say?" "I said no." She met his gaze without flinching. For the first time, she did not feel the shame of her scars. She felt them as a kind of armor. She had already survived the worst the world could do to her. This man, with his petty authority and blind hatred, was nothing compared to the fire. "You will leave this place, now." Hale laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You, and who else is going to make me?" He took another step forward, his hand reaching for her. And then he stopped. His eyes looked past her, toward the tree line. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered, melting away into stunned disbelief. The other two men saw it as well, their faces paling. Ada felt the change in the air, a sudden, profound shift in the world's balance. She dared to turn her head, her hand resting protectively on the child's shoulder. At the edge of the forest, silent as the morning mist, they stood. It was not one man, but dozens, Cheyenne warriors, mounted on horseback and on foot, their faces impassive, their presence overwhelming. They were not painted for war, but their stillness held more menace than any battle cry. They held bows and rifles, but held them loosely, at rest. They had not appeared. They had simply emerged, as if they were part of the woods itself. Among them, Ada saw women and elders, their dark eyes all fixed on her small cabin. An entire tribe, standing as silent witnesses. At their head was a man of commanding presence, his face lined with the wisdom of many winters. He was not looking at the sheriff or his men. His gaze was fixed solely on Ada. And in his eyes she saw not anger, but a deep, penetrating understanding. He was the child's father or grandfather. She knew it instantly. He was the leader. Near him sat a woman on a pony, her face a mask of anguish and hope. The child's mother. The sheriff and his men were frozen, trapped between the scarred woman they had come to intimidate and the silent, formidable force that had materialized behind her. Their bluster and righteousness evaporated into raw, primal fear. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had shattered. The Cheyenne leader, Moke Tavato, raised a hand, not in threat, but in a gesture that commanded silence. The wind rustled the leaves of the cottonwood, the only sound in the suddenly sacred space. He had heard her. They had all heard her. They had stood at the edge of the forest through the night, listening to the enemy's language twisted into a song of comfort for their lost child. They had not charged in, not attacked, because the lullaby had told them everything they needed to know. It had spoken across the gulf of language and fear, a testament to a shared humanity. Ada felt the child stir behind her. He let go of her dress and took a tentative step forward. A single word escaped his lips, a word Ada did not understand, but knew meant mother. The woman on the pony, Mesa, slid from its back, her knees nearly buckling. She took a step, then another, her eyes locked on her son. Ada knelt down, turning the little boy to face her. She looked into his dark eyes, no longer filled with fear, and gently nudged him forward. "Go," she whispered. "Go to your mother." The child ran, his little legs pumping across the clearing. The meeting was a collision of silent, desperate love. Mesa swept him up into her arms, burying her face in his hair, her body shaking with silent sobs of relief. Sheriff Hale and his men began to back away slowly, mounting their horses with clumsy, frightened movements. They did not spare Ada another glance. Their world, with its simple rules of hate and power, had been turned upside down. They spurred their horses and fled back toward Providence, leaving a trail of dust and shame behind them. Ada remained kneeling in the dirt, watching the reunion. She felt a strange mix of profound relief and a deep, aching emptiness. The purpose that had ignited within her was now fulfilled. She was alone again. But as she rose to her feet, she saw that Moquetavato had dismounted. He walked toward her, his steps deliberate and sure. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes finally meeting hers. He looked at the scarred side of her face, and for the first time, she saw no revulsion, no pity. He simply saw. He saw the fire that had marked her, and he saw the different fire that had burned in her that morning. He spoke a few words in his own tongue, his voice deep and resonant. Then he placed his fist over his heart and gave a short, sharp nod. It was a gesture of profound respect, an acknowledgement that transcended any need for translation. He was thanking her. He was seeing her, Ada Weston, not the scarred woman, but the woman who sang to a lost child. He turned and walked back to his people. Mesa, holding her son tightly, looked over her shoulder at Ada, her eyes shining with tears of gratitude. Then, as silently as they had appeared, the tribe melted back into the forest, leaving the clearing empty once more. Ada stood on her porch for a long time, watching the spot where they had vanished. The sun was higher now, casting a warm, golden light over the land. The air felt lighter, cleaner. The silence that returned to her homestead was not the hollow, aching silence of before. It was a peaceful silence, a resonant quiet filled with the memory of a song and the weight of a warrior's respect. She went back inside her cabin. It looked the same, the stone hearth, the simple furniture, the empty chair. But she was not the same. A door she thought was sealed forever had been opened. An instinct she thought was buried under ash had been rekindled. She had faced down the town's prejudice and found acceptance from the very people she had been taught to fear. The next morning, when she opened her door, she found a gift on her porch. A beautifully tanned deer hide, soft and supple, and beside it, a small, intricately woven basket filled with wild berries and dried herbs. It was a silent message: "You are not entirely alone. We see you." Ada ran her hand over the smooth leather, a true smile touching her lips. It was a lopsided, crooked thing because of the scars, but it was real. Her small patch of earth no longer felt like a fortress or a prison. It felt like home. The world was still a vast and sometimes cruel place, but she had found a new kind of connection, an unexpected kinship forged in a storm and sealed with a lullaby. The scars on her face remained, a permanent map of her past, but she now had a new story to tell, a story whispered not in shame, but in the quiet strength of a voice that had learned to sing again in the dark.